This is Jim Hughes with AFIO Now. We are a program of recorded interviews with former U.S. intelligence officers who have great stories to tell. Today, we have an important and very timely presentation. James Gosler is one of the United States' foremost experts on cybersecurity and information operations. He is a former senior scientist from Sandia National Labs. He spent some time at CIA. He served on the Defense Science Board, and currently he is a senior fellow with Johns Hopkins Applied Science Lab. But most important, Jim and I spent some time together back in the mid-1990s at CIA, where we created an organization called CITO, Clandestine Information Technology Office. This later became the Information Operations Center, IOC, and today it is the fifth and newest directorate at CIA, the Directorate of Digital Innovation. Jim, welcome to AFIO Now.
So, Jim, we had talked before in terms of kind of the approach that we would take for this. I have a very good friend, a retired NSA senior, who had asked me, about a half a dozen months ago to give a talk to his graduate seminar class at the University of Maryland. And what I think this will provide is a useful framework in terms of the cyber issues, how to think about it, how to organize the thoughts that a lot of your members already have on this topic. As I go through this, and my main day job is a senior fellow at Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Lab, as you indicated. But any comments I make today through our discussion are mine alone and don't necessarily reflect those of APL. What normally I do is I start with the kind of the bottom line up front relative what are the big ideas I want to end up sharing. But for this audience, I thought what I would do is do that second and start with kind of my view of how I characterize from a taxonomy perspective the threat. And this taxonomy came out of a 2013 Defense Science Board study on resilient military systems and the advanced cyber threat. And we basically, as a study, broke the threat up into 6 tiers, but really kind of 3 buckets. Tier 1 and 2, 3 and 4, and 5 and 6, and there's nuances between those. But it's for this, it's good enough just to have 3 buckets. The lower tier threat are basically your criminal kinds of people who are very effective at using known vulnerabilities, and somebody else has built the exploit and they borrowed it, they've stolen it, they paid for it, and then operationalize the exploit with vulnerabilities to cause problems, mostly to make money. But they typically don't have the technical expertise to discover the vulnerabilities in a target themselves, much less build an exploit to secretly take advantage of the vulnerability. The next tier up is large criminal organizations or some nation states where they have the ability to discover the vulnerability. So that's a technical endeavor, and also build their own exploits and operationalize that with their own tradecraft. As you and I have spent a lot of time talking about various forms of tradecraft over the decades we've known each other. The top tier, tier 5 and 6, are the kind of the big dogs in the game. And so not only can they do the things that we've just talked about, and if the lower tier capabilities are sufficient to achieve their operational objectives, that's what they end up doing. But in addition to all that, they have the ability to operationally introduce vulnerabilities in a target. And you kind of saw that in the SolarWinds example, where the bad guy, whoever that was able to actually get into the system and talk about how they got into it. I don't really have the details. But what they ended up doing was actually modifying an Orion update that would, basically all the SolarWinds customers would download that update into their system. That's a pretty sophisticated supply chain operation. So that takes a pretty sophisticated adversary to be able to pull that off and gain that level of scale. And kind of the nuanced difference between a tier 5 and tier 6 adversary is the level 6 adversary can do these things at global scale. So the impact, as we've seen kind of little hints of, can be fairly dramatic. So when I'm talking about threat, that's kind of the taxonomy I'll have in mind. Defending against this top full spectrum adversary, we'll talk a little bit as I'll go through here what full spectrum means, is significantly more difficult than even cybersecurity professionals realize. A lot of the intuition, I think, is in that middle tier, the 3 and the 4 tier. The level of effort the top tier guys can go to in terms of lying, cheating, stealing, and corrupting the supply chain makes it very, very difficult to defend against. And it's not just about protecting secrets that a lot of people end up go to very quickly. And there's been some notable examples in recent time in terms of where the objective was not stealing secrets. The objective was to cause a disruption in the system. You can think as a grand recent example, the Colonial Pipeline. You might have needed to steal secrets up front in order to pull off the denial of service against that pipeline, but the denial of service was what they wanted ransom. And certainly got the company's attention and it got the nation's attention. Based upon how ugly this game can get, a lot of seniors, both within corporations and within the government, would like this kind of to go away. And as you remember in our days together, there was a huge desire, although delusional, in terms of just finding a technical solution that solves this problem so that I don't have to deal with it anymore as a senior. Well, we can see, we crossed paths, over 25 years ago, Jim, and we're not a lot better off in defending against this stuff. In fact, one could argue we're worse off because our dependency has grown. So you're not likely to see today or in the near or even distant future closed form technical solutions that make this problem go away. It's not just about protecting the enterprise systems. Again, that's a thought that a lot of people end up going to. The enterprise systems of a company that basically handles the emails and web services, payroll, HR, all those kinds of things is where the guy will get into. And again, Colonial Pipeline is a great example that the bad guy actually got into the operational aspects of the business so they could shut the pipeline down. So in DoD speak, which a lot of my comments are going to be, biased with, the mission systems, the ships, the airplanes, the submarines, the weapon systems, those mission systems are as susceptible to the cyber threat as the enterprise system. So it's not just an enterprise system problem. The defensive strategy, at least in particular at the nation state level, has to be a combination of increasing the resiliency of these enterprise systems and these mission systems, along with imposing costs to the bad guy for bad behavior. And we're not really very good at, in my view, and certainly not good enough at either one of those today. Kind of an ugly, inconvenient truth associated with that is the cost imposition systems that we have to punish bad behavior, coincidentally, are also vulnerable to the same full spectrum cyber tools and techniques. So it would be very inconvenient should the bad guy find ways to get into those cost imposition systems and neutralize them. So now, deterrence is at risk if they know they can do that and we don't. So basically we need to have sufficient confidence in our cost imposition systems working in the face of these tier 5 and 6 threats. And we need to have a strategy whereby the opponent has sufficient doubt in the effectiveness of the operations they're conducting against these cost imposition systems. So if we do that well, there's enough pause in that system so that you have enough stability and really ugly things don't happen between tier 5 and 6 opponents. And it's also important to remember all these mission systems includes all the supporting elements, both within the military and the commercial sector. And in fact, there's an entanglement between the military and commercial sector. And there's ongoing studies that look at those dependencies to make sure that if we end up in a position where we have to mobilize, those dependencies that we have on the commercial and critical infrastructure will work well enough so that we can effectively mobilize. As you well know, Jim, and most all, if not all, of the members of AFIO will know that a good offensive team will do a lot of upfront work in terms of targeting and analysis. And they don't intend to apply their tools and techniques against the strength of the adversary. They're using their targeting and analysis to find a weak point, and then use sufficient strength against that weak point to achieve their objective, be it stealing secrets or causing things not to work so well, or causing the owner of that system to lose confidence in the system. Mission owners, in my experience, the people who are kind of somewhat distant from the cyber game itself, act only when they are convinced that their mission assurance, whatever that may be, is at risk due to these threats. So if the people within the cyber business are not effective enough at convincing the mission owners that their mission assurance is at risk, you're not going to get much more than lip service out of them unless they're forced to act. Basically, dealing with these mission owners, once you have built the bridge and crossed it, and they believe their mission assurance is at risk, what they're going to be faced with is some very uncomfortable decisions in terms of where and how they apply the resources they have. So that basically kind of the bottom line up front is all the major points I want to make, and then kind of the talk I'll go through kind of tries to expand on this, because right now they're all assertions. I try to put a little bit meat on the bones, as you can imagine, and well, a little difficult to do that in an unclassified setting. So when you back away today, and it's a lot better today in terms of awareness than it was when we were in the business. The cyber challenge is basically everything is dependent upon this underlying technology of microprocessors, microcontrollers, software, firmware, connectivity, et cetera. And so that underlying fabric ends up being the target that the bad guys go to get objectives at the higher level, kind of the application level, whatever that may be. These critical systems are all vulnerable to that tier 5 and 6 adversary that we talked about. And an unfortunate truth is that most of these things are vulnerable to much lower level capabilities than what the tier 5 and 6 uniquely possess. Because there's not going to be any closed form technical solution that we talked about up front, what's required to manage this threat and these risks is what I'll call a system solution to this. And we'll talk more about that as we unfold the framework. Somewhat controversial, but my sense is less so today than it was 20, 25 years ago. For key systems, this could end up being catastrophic to existential from a consequence perspective. And so you can think in terms of if you were at the precipice of war and the bad guy had access to much of our critical infrastructure, and there's not a lot for them to lose to kind of pull the trigger based upon those accesses, the impact on society and the impact on our military would be perhaps overwhelming. So kind of two perspectives, and this is with kind of probably a huge bias that I have based upon where you and I have come from, but I kind of have a view of talking points relative to how I view the mission owner's perspective, perhaps a defensive perspective, and kind of with a little bit of tongue-in-cheek, kind of how I view how the offensive people see the world. So the mission owners, it's basically an acquisition, operational culture. Things are cost, schedule, function, performance. Mission assurance in the face of their traditional threats. And the threat that we're talking about here, in most cases, is not traditional to them. It's kind of a little bit countercultural. And what a lot of effort is being done today is actually move it from the fringe and make it a traditional threat perspective that the mission owners, in particular critical infrastructure owners, have. There tends to be an abundant focus on confidentiality, that's protecting secrets, versus availability and integrity of what you own and their target. Because the focus is on confidentiality, is that there's a mindset that if I have effective implementation of advanced crypto in my system design, that kind of solves the problem because it's just a confidentiality issue. In fact, if you're worried about availability, world-class crypto could actually be a detriment, not a solution. So the confidentiality requirement and the availability requirement, what I call somewhat in tension. So if you do a lot to solve one problem, you actually may make the other problem worse. There's a perspective that if I air gap my system, their target, have solved my problem. Well, we have lots of examples where that's not quite so. Again, the primary focus is on enterprise networks, not these mission systems that we talked about. And thus, if it's all enterprise, it's kind of the CIO problem and nobody else's problem. So there's no need for me, the mission owner, to worry about it. There's also a perspective, but much less so today, that the supply chain is trusted. No one would do that or could do that. And we have more and more examples. And again, Colonial's pipeline, perhaps as an example, but certainly the solar winds is an example of that. So the bottom line is my view of their view of the threat is it's technically and operationally unremarkable. The bad guy mirror our policy and political constraints, which couldn't be further from the truth. The insider and supply chain problem is so hard, let's pretend it away. The threat couldn't or wouldn't conduct such an operation. Gosler, you've watched too many movies. And I've certainly had more than my fair share of people tell me that. And because of all that, in the face of that, and with those erroneous perceptions, why would they make the difficult trades between function, performance, and security? So it's incumbent upon people, Jim, within our community to build a credible story that's not seen as hype and over the top, to build that bridge to these mission and system owners such that they understand their mission assurance really is at risk. And these things that I just got through talking about are somewhat myths, and they really need to take those into account. So kind of the other side of that coin would be, to the joy of the offensive player, they see the target as naive, arrogant, unbalanced, and fragmented. They're fighting each other. It's common for the offensive player to attempt to operate outside the expectations of their target. So even if they're security aware, I can play a more sophisticated game and do it in such a way that, even that defensive security team would not think that would be within the bounds, and that they're not. If it's not within the bounds, they don't look for it, they don't protect against it. And there's between a level 3 and 4 adversary and a level 5 and 6 adversary, there's a lot of maneuver room between those levels. So there's, lots of play in there where they can use more sophisticated techniques and tools to operate outside the expectations of their target. Again, they discover soft spots and apply strength to weakness. And soft spots is not just the technology, which a lot of people will think. That soft spots are people and processes. And that's what made, in my view, Jim, you and I such a good team. I was kind of somewhat the conehead. I don't think you ever quite called me a conehead, but at least to my face. And you were, a guy who understood the world and how people interacted in it. And bringing those two worlds together, I think, was a uniqueness of the organization we helped get going, and very important. So the bad guy, if the soft spot is a microprocessor or a driver for an application, I'll go after that. If the soft spot is the system administrator, I'll go after him or her. Whatever it takes to win. That's the full spectrum adversary I'm kind of trying to tease out in this. Targets today are highly dependent upon commercial technology. And so a sophisticated bad guy will find ways to leverage that if they need to. That's somewhat harder. There's risk associated with it, but they have that within their tool bag. But they'll typically reserve these high-end capabilities for high-value targets that can have game-changing impact. So if I can use a low-level tool or technique to achieve my particular objective, that's what I'll use while I expose the high-end stuff. So that's kind of set up. That's what I want to kind of walk through real quick are 3 Defense Science Board studies. And again, speaking for myself and not as a former member of the Defense Science Board, to kind of, and I would highly recommend your members to get a hold of these. For the most part, the studies are unclassified, and you can download them from the Defense Science Board website. The first one was entitled Resilient Military Systems and the Advanced Cyber Threat. Lou Von Thaer and I co-chaired that. We reported out in about 2013. It was pretty controversial in 2013. The opening sentence of the executive summary basically says this, and I'll just read it. The United States cannot be confident that our critical information technology systems will work under the attack from a sophisticated and well-resourced opponent utilizing cyber capabilities in combination with all their other military and intelligence capabilities, parentheses, a full spectrum threat. And so what that basically said right up front within that report to the Secretary of Defense is that against this level of threat, he really can't have confidence that any of these systems will work. And that doesn't say none of them will work. What it says, it's going to be difficult when the going gets tough to know which of these systems that he's dependent upon the bad guy has had their way with. It's difficult unless you have penetrated the bad guy to know through observation or evaluation. And so then there's a very lengthy report that supports that assertion and provides suggestions in terms of what one needs to do. But kind of a bottom line to it is that whatever our nation's strategy relative to dealing with this problem, deterrence has to be a big part of it, because you can't solve this problem by just increasing resilience. Okay, so that led to another study that was entitled Cyber Deterrence. In my view, at least, a better title for that study would be Deterrence in the Cyber Era. And I co-chaired that with Jim Miller, who had been the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. And again, kind of like me and you, Jim had a much different view of the world than I did, and we were very, at least in my view, maybe not Jim's, very complementary. And kind of the big idea for this report was confirming the results of this resilience report that indeed cyber deterrence in the cyber era had to be foundational to our national strategy in this. And we needed to make sure that the president had more than one cost imposition tool that was highly resilient in the face of these threats. The one that people go to and think about frequently is, the nuclear deterrent. But, you don't want to have a one arrow quiver when the going gets tough. So we had suggested a couple others, but one of which, importantly, was actually offensive cyber, which is very attractive from lots of perspectives, and that you can kind of tune it up and down in terms of making sure it's proportional, sending a message that we're unhappy with your behavior. Let's talk. We need to de-escalate this crisis, not escalate it. And so one of the main outcomes of the cyber deterrence study was yet another study, and it was entitled Cyber as a Strategic Capability. Now you can see the flow here. So that was in around 2017. Chris Inglis and I co-chaired that. Chris had been most recently the deputy director at NSA and quite phenomenal. He's on the path to be the new national cyber director. The nation couldn't find a better person in the entire country to take on that job, in my view, than Chris. So most of that third study, Cyber as a Strategic Capability, we can't talk about in this forum. But we talked about that first and foremost, you need to have a strategy that's actionable. In that, from that perspective, I think we're much better off than we were back in 2017. In order to have an effective deterrence, you can't live in a glass house. So you really need to improve the resilience of lots of these systems that we're seeing being penetrated and somewhat crumbling today. So you don't want to be throwing too many stones if you live in a glass house. The third big area was the fact that we needed to really work on our cyber cadre. I was very pleased when I watched the confirmation hearings for both Chris Inglis and Jen Easterly, that the senators, in fact, very strongly bipartisan, were very concerned about the nation's cyber cadre and what we need to do, what they can do to help to increase the emphasis and excitement and career prospects for people entering this field and staying in this field. So that's a high priority to them, and I was very delighted to see that. Another area is that this is a team sport, so that the government needs to work closely with not only our industry partners, but also a lot of our foreign trusted partners, and sometimes even some partners that may not be so trusted, working together for common cause to ensure that we can work effectively together as a planet and not go over the top in some of these areas that is quite possible. So, I've used the word resilience quite a bit so far in the talk. It's hard to pin down and define. We spent a lot of time in that first 2013 study trying to define it. And in my view, we never did a very good job of it. But one thing that is clear to me, you can't talk about the resilience of a particular system unless you talk about the resilience in the face of what? A U.S. aircraft carrier and its mission assurance is not at much risk against the Taliban. But the same may not be true against a tier 5 or 6 adversary that spent decades developing techniques to try to neutralize the effectiveness of a carrier battle group in their backyard. So there's lots of things you got to worry about there. And that's the top tier 5, 6 game that we need to be playing. So because this is such a hard topic to talk about the details, and again, I'm spending a lot of time with assertions here with you, and I know you and your members will be the choir to a great degree. So finding an opportunity to kind of get into the details a little bit and kind of prove a little bit that the assertion is not just smoke and mirrors, I tend to go back in history. The best example I have found that I use to talk about what we have to worry about today is an example that the Soviets ended up perpetrating against us in the 70s and 80s. And in my view, it was a brilliant operation. It was called the Gunman Operation, the Gunman Project, that you know well. I mean, it's clearly a very dated example. Almost all your members will know the story, so I'm not sharing it to enlighten them, but on that because they already know it. But the purpose for bringing it up is it's a beautiful vehicle for basically building the story for them to share with people they want to shape their insight relative to the cyber topic. I mentioned to you before, Eric Hazeltine had written a book maybe a year or so ago. Eric had been the head of research at NSA. And the title of the book is The Spy in the Moscow Station. Eric Hazeltine, again, is the author. I would recommend it to read and digest and perhaps use the stories in that to help your members want to shape their view on the cyber problem in terms of if this is how the game was played in 1975, 1985, how might that game be played today using the technology of today as opposed to an IBM Selectric typewriter of the 70s and 80s. And in fact, I happen to have here the bar that is aluminum bar that was inside the IBM typewriter that basically the Soviets removed and replaced with an identical looking bar. And inside a cavity that they had machined out, they inserted, discrete electronics that basically allowed them to capture every keystroke that was being typed. And typically these typewriters would find their ways to, very senior administrative assistants of the senior diplomats within an embassy, and in particular the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. And then when the small buffer was full, it would find a convenient path to exfiltrate that through an off RF signal to a nearby Soviet listening post. So they typically had the talking points or what was being typed on the typewriter before the ambassador did. Pretty clever. And so again, old technology, but the way the game is played, if you dissect that old story, and Eric does a very good job of doing it, you get a pretty good sense at an unclassified level of what you might need to worry about today with today's technology. Thus, for bringing it up. So these guys, in my view, every aspect of the game, from the supply chain, the human aspect to it, the technical aspect to it, the RF aspect to it, the secrecy and counterintelligence associated with it, all coming together was, in my view, exceptionally well done. So that kind of brings me in terms of, so at the unclassified assertion level of this topic, how do I think about managing the risk associated with these tier 5 and 6 adversaries, or for that matter, the lower tier adversaries? I tend to think of it, at a very high level, and the risk is a function of 3 main parameters: the threat, the vulnerability, and the consequence if you, the owner of a system, are compromised by one of these things. And so when you think about it, if there's no threat, just peace and love in the world, then I have no risk, because even if I have vulnerability, we all love each other, so nobody would dare take advantage of a vulnerability. If I had no vulnerability, the world could be full of devils, and I have no problem because there's nothing for them to leverage. In the third category, if the world is full of devils and I have abundant vulnerability, but it doesn't matter to me in any way if I get compromised, then I have no problem either. But as you and I well know, Jim, there's plenty of devils in the world. There is abundant vulnerability in the systems because, and for one reason is the complexity of these systems is beyond imagination. So there's lots of surface area for finding vulnerabilities. As we have seen with, the pipeline issue, there's an abundant consequence if these systems get compromised. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. So if you're going to manage your risk as an individual or as a nation, you need to think about, what control do I have over the threat, my vulnerabilities, and the consequence of being compromised. And, if you're an individual or a company, you don't really have a lot of control over the threat. You depend upon your nation to cover your backside relative to that parameter. But you do have control over your vulnerabilities and the consequence of being compromised. And, in terms of continuity of operations for a company, you want to make sure that you have a backup site to continue the operations of your company should the system go down to an earthquake, a flood, or a bad guy. So, perhaps more attention needs to be looked into relative to that, because if I have to worry about a hurricane or an earthquake, I might be able to leave my backup online. But if I have to worry about a cyber guy, leaving the backup online may not be such a good idea, because if they penetrated the main system, they walk through that to my backup system and get that at the same time. So again, threat, vulnerability, and consequence is a pretty good way of thinking about it. So what are some high-level things that, in addition to that taxonomy that I came up with in terms of risk, that people can think about doing, in particular, major companies can think about doing and governments can think about doing? Well, you want to decrease the inherent vulnerabilities in hardware and software. So less complexity is a good idea. More complexity is a bad idea. You want to make it more difficult for an adversary to introduce a vulnerability through the life cycle. So this is all the supply chain kinds of stuff that we have talked about. That's a difficult thing for a company to do. It's a difficult thing for a country to do, because we're so interdependent on the planet relative to consuming technology. And it's not just the end product you have to worry about. You have to worry about all the elemental components that go into the systems that we use and that we're very dependent upon. Again, you want to, for things that really matter, you want to minimize unneeded functionality in these systems. You want to reduce complexity of the critical components in these systems. You want to increase your ability to deeply evaluate these systems. You actually like to design these systems so that they're inherently more evaluatable, right? To kind of increase my ability with tools and techniques and smart people to evaluate. And I actually, by design, make it easier to evaluate. So you kind of meet in the middle, and you end up being much better off. You want to increase the coupling between offensive and defensive elements of the business. And you want to use aggressive world-class red teaming and repeat, cycle through this on a continuing basis relative to those things that are very dependent. You want to increase the probability of detecting a component behaving badly. You want to increase the probability of attributing that bad behavior to a bad guy. And you want to squeeze them when you got to squeeze them proportionally, so that they get the message that trying to have their way with these kinds of systems is not going to go well for you. So we need to have a strategy that pulls all that together. So kind of the bottom line, and kind of almost the last chart in this, kind of the seminar that I gave, is there's no short-term answer to this, and technology alone will never be sufficient to solve it. This has got to be managed across the full spectrum threat. It's not just a technology issue. System solutions are required. But again, the partnership that you and I had was so important for that reason. Strategies to deal with these long-term challenges have to be sustainable across administrations. This can't be a partisan kind of deal. We're going to be fighting this kind of war for decades to come. You can't change the game plan every time you have seniors in government or administrations cycle through. So that's in particular why, relative to the cyber cadre, I was so pleased to see such strong bipartisan agreement relative to working that aspect of the cyber problem. And clearly there has been insufficient focus on that cyber cadre problem. In general, many mission owners lack sufficient insight into the strong connection between the mission assurance and the cyber assurance. And so we and the AFIO membership need to beat the drum, improve our ability to tell the story in a credible fashion that doesn't seem like a self-licking ice cream cone, and it's not hype. It's a credible story. And you have to do this at the unclassified level for many of the people we want to reach. So that's why the gunman story and stories like it are so useful. We need to change the emphasis between it's just an enterprise network problem from include the embedded system, the mission systems, because today the emphasis is out of balance. The probability of detection, the probability of attribution, the impact of a defensive failure, and the consequence to an attacker are way out of balance. We need to bring them into much better balance. So by improving our defensive posture and increasing our ability to impose cost and make it very clear to people behaving badly that we're willing to do that. Principal adversaries of the United States understand this as well as we do. And because of this new game, I believe that our technical superiority could end up well being an Achilles heel as we move forward if we don't find more effective ways of addressing the things that we've talked about. So it's a serious problem. You certainly shouldn't underestimate the motivation, patience, and creativity of a bad guy. They apply strength to weakness. They have a surprising set of partners. They play by a different set of rules. They see offense as a system challenge, and they're going against a defense that's naive, arrogant, unbalanced, and fragmented. If we continue playing the game like we have been for decades from a defensive perspective, we're not going to make much difference in this. And the impact of losing that defensive game is increasingly becoming clear, and it's very consequential. So that's kind of the seminar, Jim. What I could do now is kind of how I summarize that for the class in terms of what they might want to think about as they move forward in their cyber careers, or maybe start a cyber career. Would that be helpful at this point? Yes? Okay. So this is basically kind of one chart. What I suggested to them is they need to develop a balanced understanding of the following ideas. They needed to increase their technical underpinnings for this discipline, so that as they get deeper and broader within the technical underpinnings, they end up having a better understanding of what is possible and what is not possible, what is easy for the bad guy to do and what is challenging for the bad guy to do. You know, what you seek from a defensive perspective is finding a way to spend a nickel, and by spending that nickel in just the right place, you have significantly increased the risk factor to the guy trying to mess with you, right? You don't want it to do it the other way around. You don't want to spend $1 billion defensively, and what you've done to the bad guy is increased his work factor by 5 minutes, and he spends the nickel, right? So when you have a deep understanding how this full spectrum game is played, both technically and again the human angle to this, you're more apt to find a way for you to spend the nickel and for them to spend $1 billion. So you want, again, how to have a deeper understanding how this full spectrum opponent plays the game. We just talked about that. You want to make the effective investments that we just talked about. And you want to have a deeper understanding of why using offensive capabilities to support defensive objectives is absolutely critical to any national strategy. You want to understand the legal and policy constraints that we have imposed on ourselves today that we might want to examine if indeed they unnecessarily limit the effective options senior leadership within the country has. And, we've been doing that. But, some of our principal opponents don't spend a lot of time thinking about their legal and policy constraints. They can put them aside much more quickly than we do. So the next big idea I shared with the class was they need to build and evolve their story to convince seniors or people they want to influence relative to the nature of this game and the difficult trades that their bosses may end up having to make based upon how building that story. And the last idea I left them with, that this is a team sport. So the federal government, the state and local government, industry, academia, trusted foreign partners need to build and nurture these relationships, and they need to encourage their team, wherever they are within the game, to do the same. It's just too complicated to work this without integrating the various foxholes across the community. We need to bring them all to bear together to the degree you can, because there are things that are difficult to share across foxholes, as you well know. But the more we can share, the better as a team we are in dealing against these threats. So those kind of the takeaways for people, who are already in the business and people who are getting into the business, the things that they want to look for and study and learn. And then as they start learning more of that, applying it within their daily lives in the cyber game. So that's kind of it.
Jim, that was a fascinating and very timely presentation. It brings back a lot of memories of the many conversations that you and I had together when we were creating CETO all those years ago with a group of very, very talented people. I thought I would share with our audience one thought model that you and I created back in the time. And that was that we had a large group of people with very diverse skill sets. And we occupied a lot of different rooms in a very large house. But as long as there was one common room that we could come into to share our information and ideas, then we could go back to our separate spaces to do our actual work.
Well, in fact, Jim, when I remember those days, and in particular that idea you just shared, I attribute that idea to you. And you can actually see in the comments that I made earlier in the talk, there's certain doses of Jim Hughes sprinkled throughout that in terms of the influence you had over me in our time together at CETO. So I deeply appreciate that.
Well, it was a great deal of fun, and I think we can all take some pride in what we accomplished back then. Jim, I want to thank you for appearing on AFIO Now. I know our AFIO members and the students who follow us will really enjoy this presentation.